2, 1.
Groundhogs and hedgehogs. What an unlikely pair. Yet for centuries, both were believed to possess a remarkable ability to predict the weather. Long before meteorologists and smartphone forecasts, people watched these animals for signs that winter was ending and that spring was on its way. That ancient tradition eventually crossed the Atlantic Ocean and became one of Pennsylvania's most beloved celebrations, Groundhog Day. Most of us have heard of Punxsutawney Phil, but few people know that this Pennsylvania tradition began with ancient seasonal festivals in Europe and was shaped by both Celtic and Christian customs, according to Interfaith America. As a Pennsylvanian, I have always been fascinated by the unique traditions that make our state culturally distinct. Through research into the history of Groundhog Day, I discovered a much deeper story than simply a groundhog predicting the weather. So Groundhog Day is far more than a quirky weather prediction. It is the product of centuries of cultural development that began with Celtic seasonal celebrations, evolved through Christian traditions such as St. Bridget's Day and Candlemas, and ultimately became a uniquely American custom right here in Pennsylvania. To understand Groundhog Day, we first must go back to ancient Europe. The earliest roots of Groundhog Day can be found in the Celtic celebration of Imbolc. Imbolc was celebrated by ancient Celtic societies. They would divide the year according to the agricultural seasons rather than in modern calendars. And one of their most important festivals, according to Interfaith America, was Imbolc, and it was celebrated every February 1st. So Imbolc marked the midpoint between the winter solstice and the spring solstice. So winter was very, very difficult for these ancient people. Food supplies were running low, the livestock had to survive such really hard conditions, and people anxiously awaited for signs that spring was approaching. So Imbolc celebrated the gradual return of sunlight, of warmth, and of new life again. The festival became associated with Bridget, and she was a revered figure connected with healing, poetry, craftsmanship, fertility, and the renewal of new life, according to Interfaith America. And so Bridget represented hope. She symbolized the belief that winter would eventually give way to spring. And people lit fires and candles, symbolizing the return of the light. And so these celebrations focused on observing nature and watching for signs that winter is beginning to lose its grip. Everybody says amen to that. As Christianity spread through Europe, many seasonal customs were not eliminated, but they were transformed. So the Christian observance of St. Bridget's Day and Candlemas preserved many themes of light, hope, and renewal. So St. Bridget of Ireland became one of the most beloved saints in all of Irish Christianity. Historians note that many customs associated with the earlier celebration of Imbolc became connected with St. Bridget's feast day on February 1st. And then the following day was February 2nd, which was Candlemas. Now, Candlemas commemorated the presentation of Jesus at the temple 40 days after his birth and Mary's purification. So the name Candlemas comes from the blessing and the procession of the candles. So symbolism was very, very important to the ancients. And Christians viewed Jesus as the light of the world, as he still is today. And candles represented light overcoming the darkness, much like spring overcoming winter. So because Candlemas represented the spring overcoming winter, and Candlemas occurred at the same point in the season calendar as the earlier festivals did, people just continued to associate the days with observing the weather patterns, according to the Library of Congress. And so popular European sayings started to develop about these seasons. One from the Library of Congress says, "If Candlemas be fair and bright, winter will have another flight." And another popular saying of the age was, "If Candlemas brings clouds and rain, winter is gone and will not come again." And those were both from the Library of Congress. People did not have weather forecast. Folklore became the way of predicting the remainder of the winter and what it might bring. So these weather traditions eventually crossed the Atlantic Ocean. And German immigrants brought weather folklore to Pennsylvania. And they created the foundation for Groundhog Day. So during the 8th and the 19th centuries, many German immigrants settled here in Pennsylvania, according to History.com. And these settlers carried their weather traditions from York with them. So in Germany, people often watched hedgehogs or badgers emerge from their winter shelters to predict the season. And because hedgehogs were uncommon here in Pennsylvania, the settlers substituted an animal that had similar behavior, and that was the groundhog, according to History.com. So this is the moment where the modern story begins. The groundhog became America's version of the American hedgehog. The belief developed that if the groundhog emerged and saw its shadow, winter would continue. If the groundhog did not see its shadow, spring would arrive early. So what began as folklore among immigrant communities eventually became one of America's most recognized traditions. So Punxsutawney transformed this local custom into an international cultural event. And so according to the Punxsutawney Groundhog Club, the first initial official Groundhog Day celebration in Punxsutawney had occurred in 1887. And Punxsutawney Phil became the official weather prognosticator. The Punxsutawney Groundhog Club created many of the traditions that are still used today. In fact, every February 2nd, members of the inner circle gather at Gobbler's Knob before sunrise, usually in sub-zero degree temperatures, and thousands of visitors travel to Punxsutawney each year. News organizations from all around the world gather to report the event. Now, the 1993 Groundhog Day movie introduced this tradition to an even larger audience. It is now part of Pennsylvania's cultural identity, and it's an important source of traditions and community pride. So Groundhog Day demonstrates how ancient customs can evolve while still preserving their original themes of hope and renewal and anticipation. So the next time we hear about Punxsutawney Phil, we can appreciate the remarkable journey that brought this tradition to Pennsylvania. Groundhog Day is much more than a humorous weather prediction. It represents centuries of cultural development, stretching from ancient Celtic festivals to Christian observances, and finally, to modern Pennsylvania traditions. So today we have explored the Celtic festival of Imbolc, the traditions of St. Bridget's Day and Candlemas, how Germans immigrated and brought their weather folklore with them, and the rise of Punxsutawney as the home of Groundhog Day. So when Punxsutawney Phil emerges next February, remember, he is much more than just a shadow. He is doing more than serving as Pennsylvania's prognosticator. He is telling a cultural story that has traveled across centuries, crossed an ocean, and connected ancient Europe to modern Pennsylvania. Thank you.